Well, welcome everybody to the Progressive Worship Podcast from Sacredized. Today, in this episode of the podcast, I'm talking to a dear friend who I've never met in person, and I hope one day to rectify that, but I've met a few times online, and we've been communicating online for, I don't know, more
years.
than a decade, I would say.
Yeah.
Maybe even pushing close to 2 decades.
Yeah.
And her name is Marcia McFee. Marcia is what I would like to be as a ritual artist when I grow up. Just takes everything I do to a completely new level. And my work has been so deeply informed by Marcia and the Worship Design Studio. Whenever I get my hands on anything that she's written or anything she's doing, I grab hold of it because I learn so much and it inspires me. I don't think I know anybody who inspires creativity the way you do, Marcia. So I'm so grateful you've agreed to be my first guest on the podcast. So thank you for that. It's not really much of an honor, but thank you.
My
And
pleasure.
I'm just going to hand over to you to say hi and tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself better than I can.
Sure, John, it's so great to be talking to you. As you said, we have had this online relationship for a very long time. And likewise, the feeling is mutual. Your poetry is really how we first connected, because I wanted to highlight some and utilize some of your poetry in one of my worship series. And so I first fell in love with your artistry, your poetic artistry. And of course, you take it in many different directions. And I just love talking with you because it's like mind candy. We get to really talk about some things that matter deeply to us. And so I'm glad to be part of this. I think briefly what I can say about myself and my journey is that I started in my adult life as a professional musical theater and dance person, and toured the world with companies, and just a great deep love of theater, love of connecting with an audience. All of that was really important to me. And then I began to be very interested in and studying social justice issues. I was a young person in my 20s in sort of the Cold War era. And so I was very involved in peace and justice, and began to see or ask the question, how can my artistry address these issues? And having grown up in the United Methodist Church, I saw some avenues for creating performances, creating pieces, and then eventually creating liturgy that would really address from a faith perspective these very, very important issues. And so it really grew from wanting to make the world a better place. That is the bottom line. And that's sort of the bottom line now, decades later, because I've been doing this now for almost 30 years, which is a little scary to say. So that's really where it came from. I went to seminary to get a theological undergirding for this work, and then a PhD in liturgical studies, worship, and ethics. And oftentimes people say, "What? You did a PhD in worship and ethics? What does that have to do with each other?" But it's that bottom line:
Absolutely.
Making the world a better place, and doing that through ritual artistry. So that's really where it grew. Worship Design Studio officially started with podcasts in 2008, so 15 years ago this year. And I began with just sort of interviews, podcasts before people were doing podcasts. I really was just doing it on GarageBand and then throwing it up on a homemade website. And what was amazing is that there were people who flocked to this. And it was really just, we were talking about what's coming up in the liturgical season coming up, what's in the lectionary. And I started to get thousands of people listening to this thing. And I thought, wow, there's a real hunger for worship that is deeply meaningful, that's connected to the issues of our day, and that testifies to that from a faith perspective. And so that was the beginning of Worship Design Studio. And from there, I've just developed it into many different kinds of materials. And I'm just so thrilled that it's been a help to churches, especially pastors who wear all the hats, and they need some inspiration for how to create worship that's what I call good, meaningful, and memorable. That's my byline, right? Good worship. And so that's really how it all developed. And I feel so grateful to have been given the opportunities to do that.
Wow. That's a great story. My journey is of being in the pastorate, also being a musician, and then evolving into being a writer. And so had the theological undergirding from that. But in my training, in terms of liturgy, in 4 years of theological training for my Bachelor of Theology degree, we had one 45-minute lecture about liturgy. That was it. That was it. No training to speak of at all. And I began to see that there was something being missed, not just in my training, but the knock-on effect of that in practice in churches here in South Africa where I live. As I began to engage with people online, from about 2004, 2005 was when I started doing that. I was hearing the same feedback from people in other parts of the world. And I realized that we're missing the same thing. If we're going to change the world, in many ways, it's going to begin with what we do with our ritual artistry, with our liturgy, and I often think the sanctuary is the fountainhead that affects the rest of our lives.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
There.
I would say, John, that, that's pretty common in the United States in terms of how we train seminarians. They may have one semester of worship in their, in their entire learning career. And in one semester, you can barely get the history and theology of worship, much less teach people how to actually put it together.
Right.
And that's usually what suffers is the actual nuts and bolts of how do I do this? And what's ironic is that of everything that you do as a pastor, Sunday comes around every week, like clockwork, and you have to have something put together. And so the fact that we don't train people in this thing that's going to be just week in and week out is really surprising. And so I think that's why you and I have both found so many people hungry for going deeper in these skill sets.
Right. And I guess that brings us to the thing that I really want to be the focus of our conversation is the interface between worship, ritual art, ritualizing in general, and the impact of what worship can be in the lives of people. I often talk about worship as the primary form of discipleship for most people, because I don't have studies or statistics to back it up, but in my experience, most people, their only spiritual practice in the week is the Sunday service. And for some people, that's their only practice they'll be there once a month, and that's their only spiritual practice for the month. And so there's that on the one side, and on the other side is, there's lots happening in the world around worship, but most of it is coming out of a theological place that in some cases is anti anything that connects with social justice. In many cases is rooted in a fairly literalistic, maybe even fundamentalist view of scripture, and a theology that is, in my experience, quite dualistic. And while there can be lots of meaning in that, and I don't want to knock those churches, for churches that don't have that theology, there's this kind of, I don't know, disconnect between what happens in worship and what we believe. I hear people again and again saying the songs we sing contradict the messages that the pastor is preaching, or what I hear from the pastor from the pulpit is not what I hear the pastor talking about in other situations. And pastors who said to me, I could never preach what I actually believe because I'd empty my church. And so there's this kind of the shaping of worship around a fairly conservative theological framework. And yet progressive churches are desperate for a worship that has the same sense of energy and life and inspiration but with a deep theology that you would get in maybe some other churches. So that interface for me, that's and I mentioned to you before we started this recording that I read an article years ago about somebody who said that when they go to a conservative church, they love the worship because it's so inspiring, but the theology makes their hair stand on end. And when he goes to a church that's progressive and usually more mainstream, the theology is great, but the worship is dead boring. And looking for something that did both, and how that inspired my work. How do we face that challenge? What are your responses to that challenge? And what would you see as the biggest struggles facing progressive churches in the space of ritual, worship, sacrament?
Well, that's very well put, John. And I would say, let me just start with a really like basic thing, and that is that I think the biggest challenge facing progressive mainline churches is the belief that they can't have the effervescence that people experience in other kinds of styles, or that that's the only style that contains effervescence. Right. So I'm using this Durkheim's collective effervescence term to describe the kind of feeling that we have in group bodies that are participating together in things that raise and elevate that sense of oneness. And there's neurological kinds of explanations for this. I'm kind of a neurology geek around ritual, but it is about creating something that's less didactic, or at least parts of it that are less didactic and more concerned with connecting as a group body. And I think there are many ways to do that, no matter what your theology is.
Right.
But I think that we've got into these stereotypical forms, and you don't know how to do what you can't imagine. And so partly what I have tried to do is to model, what does it look like to have collective effervescence in worship that also has a very justice-oriented, progressive, inclusive message. I just led worship at a women's retreat, about 250 people. And of course, they had put this annual retreat on hold for 3 years. This was their first time back together. And I said to them the first night, we started with a chant that we could improvise with, right? That grew, a chant is great, a short chant, because you can teach it to people, they can learn it quickly. And then we can do things like rounds and canons and improvise with it, and have one part of the group keeping like a drone going and then singing over the top of it. And it's like this, it's this yummy feeling of we just created something together. Yeah. Right. And the song itself, the chant itself, very progressive, sort of gathered here in the mystery of this hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle and the power, spirit draw near, right? And then we got to just play with that. And so in some ways, it's about training ritual leaders, musicians, to get out of the box of, I'm going to lead this 4-stanza hymn, and learn a repertoire, an expanded repertoire. Especially, I'm just focusing on music at the moment, but that's your example is probably very much based on that. But I said to this group, I said, oh my gosh, at the end of it, we like soaked it in. We just like, oh my gosh, what just happened? And then I said, that is our collective effervescence that we have been missing for 3 years. And it's such an important part of being human, this feeling of connection with other people. And that's that thing that like singing together. And so we can do that. We can absolutely do that. We can create and design ritual experiences. And I use ritual and worship interchangeably. So I'm not using it. I always have to say this because oftentimes people have stereotyped this word ritual as like the sort of the rites, or the very sort of, they relegate it to just certain things. But ritualizing is what we're doing in worship. It's also what we're doing in the coffee that we drink every morning. It's what we're doing, in the ways that we order and pattern our lives. So it's a much broader definition in the way I use it. But we can do this. We just have to continue training folks, expanding our repertoire, understanding how we bring that effervescence to our worship. And effervescence can be a heightening, but it can also be a deepening.
Yes.
So another time in this retreat, we sang another refrain over and over that just took us deeper and deeper. And that's really what, okay, I'm going to get into just a very brief music theory in terms of liturgical music. And that is, we have sequential hymns, right? The 4 stanza hymns. Then we have cyclical songs, which are like these refrains. And then we have a combination of those, hymns that have verses and refrains. And they all have a different purpose. So if all we do is sequential hymns, we get great theology, perhaps, if it's, it's hymns we've picked for its theology, but we don't get the kind of heightening or deepening, because it is very much a cognitive exercise in some ways, besides musical.
Yeah.
But in these cyclical examples, its purpose is more about heightening or deepening, effervescence or quiescence, I think that's the word. And so we have to pay attention to these dynamics. Yeah. And that's when the getting gets good, right? Yeah. When we expand our repertoire and understand the purpose of what we're doing in every moment of that ritualizing.
Wow. So 3 things kind of stood out for me in what you were saying, and I hope I'm going to remember them all. I have a horrible habit of saying 3 things and I get to number 2. And so
I get it.
I'll mention them now, and then hopefully you come back to them. So
I'll try to remember them.
I just want to chat a little bit about our fear of emotionalism.
Yeah.
And talk a bit about that. The second thing I wanted to talk about was to ask the question about the extent to which most church leaders are even made aware in any way of the life-changing power, if you like, of ritualizing. That what we're doing is not just gathering for a ritual that belongs on Sunday, but we're actually doing something that impacts how we live from Monday to Saturday. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And then the third one, that's the one that slipped out of my head, and that was the one that just recently came out of what you were saying.
Effervescence, quiescence. You'll think of it.
I'll think of it. I'll let it kind of sit in the back of my mind. But let's start with those 2. So one of my questions was, when you were talking about how we can't picture this idea of progressive theology being expressed in effervescence. Do you think that there is in progressive churches a fear of effervescence because it feels like it could be emotionally manipulative? It could fall into emotionalism. We love working from our heads. We love the logic of that. We love the theology of that. But we're a little nervous when that gets laid aside and the heart takes over. We don't trust that. Do you think that might impact some of
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, you've hit the nail on the head. And really, it's the Enlightenment problem, right? And it's the Descartes error. I'm going to go back to neuroscience here, because Descartes' error is thinking that the mind and the emotions are somehow working separately, and they're absolutely not. You don't have a thought without an emotion attached to it. Right. That's in neuroscience, right? So the idea that we could separate those things is false. We can bore ourselves to death to the point where we don't have vital emotions. But
dynamics was the third point. You've just hit it.
Okay, good. Write that down. So absolutely, that is one of the problems. And I will tell you that I have often used a beautiful song called "Shepherd Me, O God," in workshops, and I invite people there's verses that I sing as a solo, and they come in on the refrains, and in the midst of it, I have them whisper aloud the 23rd Psalm in their own rhythm. So what you hear all over the room is, it's just gorgeous. just gorgeous. And because I invite them before we begin to sing even, I invite them to imagine themselves at their favorite body of water. And then to imagine someone with them, perhaps someone they've been missing, someone that they are, needing to pray for, that kind of thing. I invite that, so kind of in a visualization. So by the time we get done with this lovely experience, people are having emotions, right? And so I always, as we analyze it, because that's what I do in a workshop, we do something that's worshipful, and then we analyze what happened. Always have someone say, how is that not manipulative, right? And I know that when that question comes out, it is the fear of emotions and the role of emotions in our ritualizing. And so for me, the difference between something that's manipulative and not is the ritual artist's intention for an end result. So I think about, I grew up in a United Methodist Church, progressive, but in a rural, progressive United Methodist Church, very blessed in that way. And I went with friends one time when I was a kid to their revival at a not so progressive church. And so I experienced this thing where we were singing and singing until people came up for the altar call, right? And I experienced this this revival leader looking right at me and saying, every head bowed and every eye closed. And I was a shy kid. But at that moment, I crossed my arms and I just looked right back at him. I don't know where it came from, but I remember that. So I have this visceral memory of what it feels like to be manipulated. And I know his intention for me personally in that moment was for me to comply and then to respond in the way that he had orchestrated. So that's obvious manipulation to me. To create a moment or to create a container in which people can have full emotions, I don't believe is manipulative. And that's the structure that I described in that time, which was to invite people to their own memories, right? Come up with your own memory, your own person you want to pray for. Here's this lovely song that is the 23rd Psalm. The verses are the 23rd Psalm, but differently. And then you get to whisper aloud the 23rd Psalm in the midst of it. And that whispering keeps it intimate, and yet it's a community experience.
Right.
You're having a personal and communal experience at the same time. That's a container.
Right.
What you experience in that, I cannot control, and I don't plan to control that.
Yeah.
I just want you to have that, because there are so few ways that we get to have a curated experience that allows us access to the deepest things we know.
Yeah.
Movies do that for us.
Yeah.
Now, these same people who worry about manipulation in worship probably wouldn't have a problem with going to a movie and in the movie making it, them ending up crying at the movie. Right? And worship and ritualizing is storytelling.
Exactly.
We just created a story.
Right.
But it's connected to a scripture, it's connected to the singing, it's connected to the memory, the visualization. So yeah, but your point about the fear of that. And so we're going to be as didactic as possible so we don't get close to our emotions.
Yeah.
That is absolutely, I think it's a false belief that if we have moments like that in worship, that we can't also have moments where we're picking apart a scripture and analyzing and getting new ahas about how that relates to our life and making the world a better place.
Yeah.
They can coexist. Absolutely. Easily.
There's a sense, the other false assumption we make is that it's only emotions that can manipulate us.
Right.
A good public speaker, good rhetoric can manipulate your mind as easily
right.
as an artist can manipulate your emotions. So you can be manipulated in both places. And I think your point about the intention is so important. The words that were coming to my mind is it's how we handle the power dynamic of that. Because as a ritual leader or as a preacher, we're in a place of power. We've been given this power which we can abuse. We can use it as a power over, and we can command and demand and dominate. We can use it as what I would call power under, which is that manipulative thing where I'm looking ever so humble and I'm looking like I'm serving you, but actually what I'm doing is I'm pulling the levers behind and manipulating you. Or we can do a collaborative power with, a power sharing, which is what creating a container is. It's moving out of that central role and giving space for people to do their own work in a curated environment. But it's a power sharing, and you can't manipulate people when you're sharing power.
That's right.
And so, yeah, that was some of the things that came.
Beautifully said. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
That's as much true as a preacher as it is for a ritual artist, I think.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, manipulation can happen in many ways.
Yeah.
And that can be in a beautifully constructed, seemingly logical way of thinking that is completely, not just, I mean, people have been doing that for forever.
Yeah.
So yeah, we really have to get out of this sort of dichotomy of, justice-oriented, progressive ritualizing is going to be very heady.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
Right? We are going to use our heads because we're not going to check our minds at the door.
Yeah.
But we also, going back to that idea that thoughts and emotions are connected, emotions are also the seat of motivation.
Yes.
And if we divorce emotions from our ritualizing, we are not going to access what is actually quite an incredible tool for motivation for the hard work of creating a more just world. This ain't easy, right?
Yeah.
And so if we divorce ourselves from our emotions, it's going to be even harder.
Yeah.
Because that motivation, that fire to make the world a better place, or that pathos.
Yeah.
Right? We need that.
Yeah.
We absolutely need that. And ritualizing is that container.
Yeah.
One of the containers. I don't think it's the only way, but it is that's what we're talking about today. Exactly. What we're called into, and that is ritualizing. And so understanding the nature of those containers and how to bring out the best in that in order to form, as you say, disciples, to be agents of justice in the world. I always say ritual does form us. The question is, to what are we being formed?
Right.
Right?
The way I phrase that is your worship defines your life. Yeah. Or how you worship defines how you live.
Yeah.
Because we all worship something, right? Whether we're in the church or in a religious environment, we're all worshiping something. We're all ritualizing around that thing we worship. James Smith, of course, in his books talks wonderfully about the way he exegetes cultural liturgies and how things like the shopping mall or the sports field, the political arena, these things are places of ritual. These are places of worship, and they're shaping our lives. And that's what ritual does. And you leave emotion out of that, well, we're getting misshapen. We're getting malformed.
Yeah. You mentioned an author. I'll mention another one. David Kurtzer wrote Ritual, Politics, and Power.
Oh, wow.
And I teach a ritual studies course, and I'm teaching it this semester. And I bring Kurtzer in about 4 or 5 weeks into the semester because he's so good at opening our eyes at the formative power of ritual and the possibility that it does manipulate. In that, it can do that. Because I don't want my students to be just like enamored with ritual so much that they're not discerning some of the ways that it can be misused and abused. So yeah, it's really, really important for us to know more about, 1 45-minute class is not going to cut it. 1 semester is not going to cut it as we train folks. And I think that's why you and I both train folks post seminary, post, official training, because there is a gap there, and we want people to understand how to understand it better, but also then how to do it better, so that we do get the results that we hope for, and that is an animated faith that draws us into the world.
Yeah. I mean, historically, I mean, you can go back over any protest. I can think about the civil rights movement in the US. I'm thinking about the struggle in South Africa. People in South Africa, we have a word. I don't know if you've come across it. It's the word toy toy. Toyi, toy toy. And when people protest in Africa, there's dancing, there's singing, there's movement, there's often rhetoric as well. But it's a tremendously moving, can even be a frightening thing to watch people en masse coming down the road, not marching but dancing, and
that's right,
in the harmony that, I don't know,
yes,
somehow only Africa seems to be able to do. But
right,
there's something phenomenal about that, and without the emotional energy of that, those protests wouldn't get anywhere.
That's right.
The apartheid government would not have been overthrown unless there was a massive amount of emotional energy. Yes, intellectual energy was there, but the emotional energy as well, and the ritualizing that went with that. Because the toy toy is a ritual, actually.
The actual coming together to be together in the streets is ritualizing.
Right.
And that, again, that collective effervescence, that knowing that you are not alone in the struggle.
Yes.
So there's that personal piece of it that you get from that connection. But also, like you said, seeing the mass come down in that kind of energy that will not be denied.
Right.
That's also part of it. Yeah, absolutely. I use that example when I'm talking about dynamics and energy. There's my dissertation was about dynamics, 4 kind of basic patterns of dynamics, and one of them is that dynamic that is that change the world kind of feel. And I used the example of Siyahamba, right, in anti-apartheid protests. And then, the way that sometimes in the US, lily white choirs will sing, "We are singing in the light of God." It's like we need the story with the music to remember and to honor the kind of power, the kind of courage that contained, and not to literally whitewash it in a way.
So let me skip over my number 2, because I think that'll come best at the end. You mentioned dynamics again here, and I think let's go there for a moment, Marcia.
Okay.
Because one of the challenges I think we find in particularly in progressive worship is a lack of dynamics in a worship service. I don't know if you experience that, but certainly from my perspective, there's often this experience where you come in and things are very measured and very quiet and very intellectual. And yes, we may have an organ, and if the organ is played well, it can lift the ceiling, but we're often not too sure we want to do too much of that. And everything is done with such decorum, and from beginning to end, there's hardly a shift in dynamics. I remember when I talk about crafting what I would call an order of service or a worship flow or the worship journey, I often used to say to people, do yourself a favor and actually create a graph. And the what's that? The X,
like a heart monitor.
Along the bottom, you talk about the time of the service from start to finish. And here is what I used to use the word intensity, because I don't really know what other word to use, but the bottom would be sort of quiet and deep. At the top is more maybe effervescent, loud, noisy, celebratory, and you're moving between those. And yes, there may be some times where it's appropriate to stay quiet and deep the whole way through. There may be some times where it's appropriate to stay quiet, loud and boisterous the whole way through. But most of the time, we want to be moving through those dynamics in a meaningful way. so the people have a sense that they're going on a journey, that they've started somewhere, they've been through a journey, and or they've been participating in a story, maybe is the way to phrase it. You've used that word a lot. That's one I use a lot as well. And then they've got somewhere at the end, but that it's also gives them the sense the story's not finished, and so they're going out of this moment into a continuation of the story in the rest of the week. But it takes planning and careful thinking to create those dynamics. You know, you talk in your book How to Think Like a Filmmaker, which I loved, about the way scriptwriters work and the different narrative arcs of an episode versus a season versus an entire show, and all of those different narrative arcs. That doesn't happen by accident for scriptwriters for shows and movies. That every bit of that is so carefully crafted. And that's what ritual artists are called to bring into the worship space. Yet we so often miss that. So what response to that be? I mean, how do you work with those kinds of dynamics? How do you use dynamics to help create that container, and then also enable people to go on that journey where they actually can feel that something has shifted in them?
Yes. Well, so it's my favorite topic.
Oh, wonderful.
So what you're describing, this sort of methodical kind of, I was asked long ago, a reporter asked me, what do you think is the biggest problem with worship in our day? It's like, but I said, it just popped out of my mouth, and it made sense to me. And then therefore it became a really major motivator for me to be able to talk more about it. And that is worship that is flatlined, right? So like the heart monitor, of worship that is flatlined. In other words, monotony comes in many forms. And I used the word boring earlier, and usually I need to unpack that because people will assign certain styles of worship as boring or not boring, right? So I have seen boring in every style. Let's just say that. It's really about monotony. And any style of worship, when it gets monotonous, can flatline, no matter what level of dynamics you're at. And so what you're describing as methodical is actually is a dynamic. So it's not, I try to get people out of saying, well, this was dynamic and this was not dynamic. It's just different intensities, right? To use your word, it's different dynamics. And there is a place for all of it. And there are two ways where we need diversity of dynamics. One is within a service, but also within that larger story arc that is the liturgical year. So for instance, during Lent, we are going to have a dynamic that is perhaps a different feel or ethos, we can use that word, than the Easter season, right, that follows it. Because theologically, they fundamentally have different ways of being in our bodies and ways of expressing ourselves, different parts of the story. And so in order to tease out the rich theology that is the liturgical year, we have to imagine that the congregation will feel different in Lent than it will in the Easter season and across the year. So there's the shorter arc, which is the worship service itself. It might even be a season itself. And then the larger arc of the whole liturgical year, the whole narrative. So the dynamics, when we begin to see that there are various dynamics, and they're not just two. I did mention the most commonly held thoughts about dynamics, and that is effervescence or, big kind of, and the more quiescent, the more sedate, the more contemplative. But there's actually more than that. And these dynamics can, in the research I did, and it's based out of kinesiology, which is based on the way our bodies actually work, that we have different energies. And yes, we can have that dynamic, get her done, justice oriented, get out in the streets, kind of thrust dynamic. But we can also have what's called a swing dynamic. And that is that sense of energy that is connecting. right? That wants connection, that's going back and forth. That's, this is worship in the US anyway. Jazz has brought us some swing. The contemporary worship movement in some of its more personal theology brought us some of that. And in the ways that it's, the sort of love song is the typical swing kind of dynamic. But too much of a good thing is still too much, right? So any one of these things can become monotonous, and then we turn it off. Our brains are so talented that we can actually turn it off because we think, oh, been there, done that, don't need to process that anymore.
Right.
There's also a kind of shape feel, which is that we, sort of more what you might be calling methodical. So it's exacting, it's precise, it's canonical language, if we talk about language styles. And shape can give us that theological sense of the God who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And that's an important piece, but it's not the only piece. Right. And then there's the very contemplative, what I call in dynamics, a hang kind of feel. And that is that sort of meandering, or that contemplative, sing until it just feels right to stop, not sing 3 times, right? And then stop. It's a much more open kind of just sensing the moment in a very deep, that's that still small voice of God, right? Each of these has these theological grounding, each of these dynamics. And the important reason to bring all of those in, it's not as if every service is going to have equal measures of everything. It depends on the theme, it depends on the lesson, it depends on the time of the liturgical year, what of those things are going to be dominant, but they're not going to be dominant to the exclusion of all else. Right? It's this stuff is so yummy once you dig into it, dive into it, and you say, oh, let's look at it from all of these angles. And then we can really see, there's a spiritual purpose, and there really is kind of a justice purpose to each one of these as well. Right? It's not that the go get them, change the world energy is the only one related to justice. There's also contemplative ways that we bring justice into the world. There's also connecting ways that we bring it into the world. And there's also the ordering of that shaping energy that's also really important in making the world a better place. So, we are so quick to dichotomize and to categorize, and then to say this equals this, and then cut ourselves off from a much more expressive, complex way of thinking. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so exciting. And you talk about the service versus the year, and there's a sense in which, as you say, Advent, Lent, Christmas, they all have a different feel. But it's not like every Sunday in Advent is going to have the same feel. There are dynamics within the Lent bandwidth, if you like, that we can play with as well, and still keep in that space, in that collective dynamic, if you like, of the journey. But there's movement there. And on the other side of it is, swinging through the dynamics too much becomes bipolar. And that's not going to be either. So it has
to whiplash, or
So there has to be thoughtfulness to it. There has to be a sensitivity to it. It's not just dynamics for dynamics' sake, or changing of dynamics okay, we're going to do something boisterous, so we now have to go to the greatest extreme of boisterosity, whatever the word is that we can.
Boisterosity, I love that.
Sorry, I do have a tendency to make up words sometimes. So it's all of that is at play, and I think that can be overwhelming for people. But I think the word play is one we don't use enough when we talk about ritual and worship. And I think one of the things you do so well, as I've experienced your work, is that you invite people into the ritual space as a space of play. And kind of don't worry too much. I mean, yes, obviously there's stuff you can do that can be harmful, and we've spoken about manipulation and things like that you want to avoid. But there is a sense in which you can come in and you don't have to be bound too much by rules, although good play also does have boundaries and rules. But but there's a sense of experiment. Try stuff out, see what works. You know, if it doesn't work this week, we go, okay, well, sorry, folks, we'll try again next Sunday and hopefully do a bit better based on the lessons we've learned.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
there's a freedom there. And perhaps because of that very intellectual, cognitive approach that we've got, we're a little nervous of experimentation and making mistakes and allowing things to be a little different and chaotic.
Wow.
And so,
Yeah, and I think that you're making so many good points about change and flexibility within liturgy, right? So, scary thing, right? And I think I employ a couple of things in my design work that acknowledges this, and that is any one liturgical season that I am designing is going to have a feel or an ethos, right? It's going to have, it might be something like, I have a series called Busy, Reconnecting with an Unhurried God. Well, the ethos of that is going to be, let's slow down a little bit, right? So we're not going to pack it full. We're not going to pack that worship service full of busyness, because the main message is
slow down.
Make some space, right? So we're going to make some space in this particular series.
Right.
Because the form of it then is part of the message, right? And so we're going to employ things like, perhaps we're going to spend more time in silence, but we're going to talk about why we're spending more time in silence, right? It's going to be part of the message. Maybe we're going to sing more songs that are slower or more spacious. And then we're going to repeat those structures throughout the season so that, the first week, if it's something we've never done before, that's going to feel awkward, because the first time we get on a bike, it's awkward. But if we never get on a bike ever again because it felt awkward, we never learn to ride. And so we repeat, right? And so if we do some things that are different, but we repeat them through a season, then we begin to get this inherent flexibility muscles in our community. And play and improvisation becomes easier because we begin to trust our leadership, that they will guide us and allow us to become more comfortable with this thing that feels awkward at first. There's a series that I did in the last year that's about change, and change is so scary that I made the ethos of the series playful. And the theme song says, change is good, you go first, da da da. It's like this little ragtime thing that kind of pokes fun at our discomfort about change, because that's the way we can enter into these scary things.
Right.
So that's a completely different ethos.
Right.
And we use Play-Doh, right? We're playing because we're dealing with a really hard subject that's very scary. So these are some of this is why being a ritual artist is so much fun. Right. Because you get to sort of make these design choices, these artistry choices that help us to speak about those deep things, to get at those spiritual issues that do make a difference for our lives the rest of the week, the rest of our lives. And we do it in a way where we allow the ritual forms to help us.
Exactly.
To do it.
Yeah.
I cannot remember what your question was, but I hope that.
Yeah, I think you responded to it so well. Yeah, and I like where you've landed at the end of that, because I was going to say, let's now talk about this thing, because the challenge, I think, often of ritual artistry is that the worship space becomes an experience that becomes addictive, and we can fall into this dynamic where we're there because we need the buzz, we need the fix, and then we go out into the rest of our week, and the fix carries us for a while, and then the next week we run dry, and we need a new shot, but in between, it's not impacting our lives at all.
Yeah.
So how do we do this So that
Yeah.
we're creating all of this, we're giving people that container, we're allowing them to bring them their whole selves, body, heart, mind, spirit, all of it into that experience. They are hopefully getting aha moments and processing things they need to process. But when they step out of the sanctuary and back into the rest of their lives, what do you do, or what is your thinking around how we give people stuff to take with them so that it actually does make an impact on their relationships at home, on what's happening at work, on the greater social issues of our neighborhood, our country, our time?
Yeah. And that's such a great question. And that's why it can't just be about dynamics. It has to be about symbols. And so that's why I say worship must be meaningful and memorable, right? It can be meaningful in the moment, but if it's not memorable and doesn't, so Kurtzer, this author that wrote Ritual Politics and Power, uses a wonderful theory from cognitive science. We think in schemas, right? Our brains are organizing what we know into frameworks. Is another way to say schemas, right? Into frameworks. And we can only really see what we have a framework for. I mean, it's this bizarre thing. Like it's what happens when you hear a word that you've never heard before and you go, oh my gosh, I've never heard that before. And then you hear it 2 more times, like in the rest of the day, and you go, oh my gosh, because now you have a framework. Now you have, so you're seeing it, you're hearing it, you're recognizing it. So what I do in my worship design is I create frameworks of meaning. And frameworks of meaning need really, really good symbols. Tangible, visual. I mean, symbols can be verbal, visual, kinesthetic. They can be many things, but we need symbols, and symbols are, by definition, ordinary things that point to extraordinary realities, right? So always remembering to connect what we do in our rituals, in our liturgy, with ordinary things that then are part of our ordinary lives, so that we create frameworks of meaning, so that when we encounter these frameworks in our ordinary lives, it's tied to the meaning that we made in the ritual, right? So one of the very first things I do when I come up with, okay, here's a message I think we need for this year in Advent, right? I say, okay, how does this manifest itself in our lives? What are the main symbol systems that we can connect? So I'm going to use my Advent series, not this last one, but the one before. And I called it The Inn, Housing the Holy. And I did this I had done some research with a Lilly grant about churches who were doing extraordinarily entrepreneurial things with their properties to serve their neighborhoods. And I was so inspired by these interviews that I did with these churches that I thought I need to make an Advent series out of this, because I want to highlight, because for many churches at post-pandemic, we realized, oh, the church is not the building, but we have this building and we're paying for this building. This building is our greatest asset, but what are we doing with it, right? So I wanted to highlight that. And so part of the Advent Christmas story is that inn, right? Whatever that really was, we don't know, but the inn, the image of the inn, and then housing the holy, understanding that, okay, our churches may feel like the barn. We may feel like the barn, but it can still house the holy in important ways, just like this narrative of ours. So the barn, but more concretely, what is in our lives that would evoke this message every time we saw it? And that is the barn door. And so within the liturgy, I talked about doors. I talked about opening the doors of our heart. I talked about, I commissioned a song by a wonderful artist where the word stable was used in 2 ways, right? A stable place, but a stable, right? So this whole word play, but that door, and so churches had a barn door as part of their, in the midst of all their Christmas, Advent Christmas stuff, churches incorporated a barn door. People took their Christmas card pictures in front of the barn door, but every time you saw a door in the world, it connects back to that message.
Right.
Opening the doors of our heart, opening the doors, hospitality, serving our neighborhood, being, making our neighborhoods better. So this is the way that I think, that I know that our liturgies can connect to the rest of our life when we have this symbol system, this framework, this frame of reference that can then carry out throughout. And our brains are amazing. They love symbols. They love them. And they start to notice things, because you've got this framework, and your liturgy has talked about doors and doorways, and then you start to see that everywhere in the world. So that's the way I do that. That's the way that my research into cognitive science and understanding how that works for us, how making meaning and making memory works. And so that's one of the techniques that I use in my design work that I think really, and by all accounts, feedback, it does its job. It really does its job.
Well, I mean, that's the principle of the sacraments, isn't
Right.
it? Bread and wine,
Exactly.
every day. Remember me. Now, every time you sit around a meal table, Christ is there, is remembered.
Right.
Washing, every time you wash your hands. And I know I've done that in many rituals where I don't know if it's the same in the States, but in South Africa, people sometimes get a little awkward and uncomfortable around foot washing.
About the feet thing.
Yeah. But hand washing is often easier. But to connect that hand washing with remembering baptism.
Right.
And then every time you wash your hands, it's a kind of baptismal moment again.
But we have to, as ritual leaders, we have to keep making those connections.
Exactly.
And if eating and washing are the only symbols we use in our worship, then they become, monotony comes in many forms, right? They become as monotonous as, say, a dynamic of music or a certain way of doing something all the time.
Right.
So bringing in these other ordinary objects alongside these traditional things is a way of waking us up, but constantly making that connection. I remember, during the lockdown, the Holy Week, the very first Holy Week during lockdown, my partner is a pastor, and she did a sermon at the kitchen sink, at our kitchen sink, in the kitchen, talking about, and prepared a meal as she was preaching, and then washed and invited people to go to the sink and wash their hands. So for all of the agony of the lockdown and of that time period, it also woke us up to some ways that we can connect our very ordinary lives and our homes, our environments outside of the sanctuary, how those are also sanctuaries. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow, Marcia, this has been so rich. It's amazing. We're going to have to start wrapping it up.
Sure.
I don't want to finish this though without just giving you a chance. You've just written an article. You sent me a copy. Metamorphosis Moment, Ritual Artistry and the Work of the People. I know you're going to give me a link that I'll put in the description so people can access a version of that article that you are allowed to share. So if people want to go and check it out. But I'd love to give you a chance just to maybe the highlights of that article, why you wrote it, anything you want to say around that. I'd love to hear that.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I've been talking about this moment, sort of post-ish pandemic, as a metamorphosis moment for about a year or so. And I really, the metaphor really works, because I think we feel like we're kind of goo at the moment. We're not sure what the next chapter looks like, because we had so many shifts in our rhythms, so many shifts that we're still trying to unpack and understand. And so one of the things that I think is so compelling about the process of metamorphosis is that the caterpillar actually has what's called imaginal discs inside of it. And these are bits of DNA, globules of DNA that don't do anything in the caterpillar, but once it's in the cocoon and things are disintegrating around it, these imaginal discs start to come alive, and they are what becomes the butterfly. So I believe that we have inside of us some ritual knowledge, some ritual artistry that will help us navigate whatever is to come for the church. I think that ritualizing, making meaning is so deep within us as humans, and I talk about this in the article, that will not go away.
Right.
But we as ritual artists must, as we have throughout time, reconfigure the ways that we make meaning and make that accessible to others and lead others in making meaning. And so I give some examples of how I think we can, hopeful things that we can think about as we move through this goo moment where we're not sure. And in the end, I think I have great hope that whatever configuration the church takes in the future, we will always need leaders and communities that are making meaning together. That will never change.
Right.
And so to understand that ritual artistry is about finding those ways, nurturing those ways, making those containers. The containers may look different, but nonetheless, we need those containers. And so especially these days, I think there's so many people who are not finding spiritual nurture in the church, that it's an important time for us, especially those of us who consider ourselves ritual artists, to be examining and improvising and playing with what containers can we offer to people, no matter whether they're connected to church organizations or not. And John, you've been, doing so much of that. And I commend you for that. And I pray that you'll keep going. But, I thank you for this time of talking. I really feel so glad that we've had this. I think it's probably been a couple of, at least 15 years that we've been in conversation. Someday we will get to be physically together and doing this, but thank you for the opportunity to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom, your enthusiasm, your passion, your creativity. It's been such a gift. I'm so happy that I can share this with the people in my network. Yeah. Maybe just as we close, and I think we're going to have to do this again, because I can feel like we could do another hour or two of this and we still wouldn't be finished. So we're going to have to do another one at some point. But just to wrap up, to give you a chance, where can people find you? How can they connect with you if they want to? And obviously we'll put all those details in the descriptions as well. But
yeah. So worshipdesignstudio.com is where you can get a first glance at what Worship Design Studio does. And it's part education, part resources. We create worship series. We've been doing it for many years now. So we have 70 plus worship series for every part of the liturgical year, lectionary, non-lectionary. And it's a community. We're now on a social platform. So it's a community of people who are collaborating together and giving each other support. So that's a place. You can also go to marciamcfee.com and learn various things that I'm doing. I am now have something called Spiritual Care Adventures, and it's travel. I take groups of people on meaningful travel. So there's that as well. So it's a good time to be doing this and finding meaning in many different ways.
Wonderful. Marcia, thank you so much. And just thank you for the work that you do and the impact it makes on the church and on people's lives. Certainly has impacted me tremendously deeply. You've given lots of ideas that I'm going to be stealing for some of my resources out of this, even this conversation. So thank you for that. And may you continue to experience a sense of, and I don't say blessing easily, but I wish that for you, a sense of blessing on the work that you do. And thanks again so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Great.